Dr. Tanya Serry. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I am really excited to have this chat today because we are going to be talking about one of something that is extremely interesting to me and lots of people, which is how do we actually, or how should we actually be teaching kids to read and write in Australian schools? And I don't know if this is just me, but I would argue that you and your team there at the Solar Lab are probably the most qualified or amongst the most qualified people in the entire country to talk about this. So it's fantastic that you're such an authority on the matter. I know we're going to have lots of interesting points to talk about. And I basically just want to dive in because this is a big problem. It's been a contentious area for quite a while. There's the reading wars, there's the science of reading. And I know that research has been going on for quite a long time about this, and yet it's still to some degree contentious. To orient us to this problem, do you think that you could give us an overview of, I guess, what the problem is, what the statistics are that sort of say that there is a problem here in how we teach kids to read and write in Australia?
Well, that's a fabulous way to start. I certainly support the notion that teaching reading or reading instruction has been contentious for decades. And it's a really big tragedy in my view because the evidence has been in for about 4 or 5 decades about what the brain needs, how we need to teach children to read. And for various reasons, often quite socio-politically driven as opposed to research driven, that evidence hasn't been embraced. So I'll start with a small but potted summary of history. Many of your listeners may know about whole language, which
Mm-hmm.
really took force in the 60s.
Mm,
And that was a very well-intentioned approach to reading instruction that unfortunately had no firm evidence behind it. It was very child-focused. Essentially, the approach was that we immerse children in wonderful literature, read to them, give them beautiful books, have lovely nooks and corners where we teach children to read. Teachers don't need to actually teach explicitly or in any kind of didactic way. It's all going to happen by osmosis because of the environment. Children will love to read, love reading. They'll learn because they love it. They want to know stories. So again, you can see that there's very good intentions there, but unfortunately it didn't work.
mm-hmm.
So by the time we got to the sort of 80s and early 90s, when reading proficiency rates were absolutely plummeting around the world, I'm going to focus on English-speaking countries.
Mm-hmm.
That's where my main knowledge is. And English, a complex, it's a fairly opaque language in terms of the spelling system. It hasn't got a transparent orthography, such as a language like Spanish or Finnish. It's complex. Anyone who's
Mm,
looked at the spelling system knows there's many more rules than we often think, but it's complex.
mm-hmm.
So by the 80s and 90s, when people were scratching their head and thinking something's really not working here, whole language became sort of morphed into what people might know as balanced literacy. And that term was very specifically chosen because it was going to be a balance between whole language, that really enriched space, with some phonics or some more
Mm-hmm.
explicit teaching of the code.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that has not ever really been successful because what is balanced to one person, a bit of this and a bit of that, might have a very different formula in another classroom.
Yeah.
And there was still not an emphasis on explicitly teaching children to break the code.
Mm-hmm.
In the early 2000s, there were three international inquiries, one in America, the US National Reading Panel, one in Australia, the National Inquiry into Teaching of Literacy, and one in the UK, led by Jim Rose, called the Rose Report. They all came up with the same information. That was big literature review and some consultation. Not surprisingly, they all came up with the same summary findings because they all relied on the same quality literature that hadn't really been embraced by educators and by those teaching pre-service teachers, that children need to be explicitly taught that reading and, of course, spelling and writing is not natural. Our
Mm-hmm.
brains are not wired to become literate. We are
Mm-hmm.
wired to acquire oral language, but we are not acquired to become readers. If no one teaches us how to do it, we're probably never going to be very good at it. In the same way that
Mm,
if no one taught you how to play chess, You wouldn't
Uh-huh.
become a chess player, let alone
Mm,
a master chess player. So there's been a long, complex history. And because of the political and the social equity aspects, or social justice aspects, I probably should say, of child rights and not imposing on the child, the view of explicitly teaching children the code was seen as a bad thing to do. But in fact, that's really what we need, whether we're learning to read or learning other skills. The
mm,
human brain is set up so that we take in small chunks of information at a time. We practice, 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 and then cumulatively build. So the evidence was absolutely in, if it hadn't been picked up earlier, but by the mid 2000s, there really was no question about the most efficient and effective way to teach students to read, but it still hasn't been fully embraced around the world.
mm,
It's moving. Australia has always been a little bit behind America. With those three national reports I mentioned, the UK took on board the findings more rapidly than the United States and Australia. In Australia, for those listeners who wanted to look up the National Inquiry into Teaching of Literacy. It's 2005. It's quite stale now, but it's a fantastic report. There were 20 recommendations of things that you could predict. Students need synthetic phonics. There needs to be regular progress monitoring. University students need to be trained to teach it explicitly, and so forth. The
mhm,
20 recommendations, and none of them were ever legislated. So this report was done by some real experts, some researchers and practitioners, and has literally collected dust
mm,
for the last 20.
mm,
There has been some more recent reports that I can talk about perhaps shortly, but in some, its reading instruction has remained contentious. It's been too overlaid with a lot of ideology, what we think children need and want, without really looking at the way the brain works, a human cognitive architecture, the fact that reading is biologically secondary, which means it's one of those myriad of skills that we need to be taught. We're not going to just get it by osmosis, as in that whole language ideology, which sounded really nice, but sadly is not effective because of the way that the human brain is structured.
mm.
Let's pause there because it was a big potted history over about 55 years.
No, I think that's really helpful because probably a thing that people are missing is the historical context because they just get shown this thing. They're like, oh, here's the whole language approach or the balanced literacy approach that we use without realizing that there's been all this other stuff happening in the background for decades and changes that have been either happening or trying to happen. And without realizing that, it's hard to know that what you're doing is not necessarily correct. Is it true that people were also misled a bit, not only by the very nice sounding names of balanced literacy and whole language and that sort of thing, but by the fact that there were a portion of kids who seemed to respond to it, and that might have misled the academic educational system, despite the fact that huge numbers of kids were being left behind? Is that sort of how it panned out in the research?
Yes. And it's fortunate for children who, despite their education they received, the early reading instruction, became proficient readers. And that's probably going to be a large proportion of your audience here that kind of argued against or posed a case against what I've just said, because about 50 to 60% of children will be fine despite the instruction that they've received. The reasons for that are often related to this social equity, social gradient scale that we have. So these children typically come from homes that privilege education. Children have been read to, they've come to school with really well developed oral language, big vocabulary, lots of life experiences, so that when at school they're reading a book about the zoo, they've been to the zoo. So a lot of world knowledge and background knowledge.
Mhm,
Not saying that these parents teach their children to read. Some of them might try to. It's something I don't recommend for anyone.
mhm,
But what it's really doing is widening the social equity gap, because the children who come from less advantaged homes, whatever reason, their parents aren't able to have such rich verbal and written dialogue and exchanges
mm,
and everything else that goes along with less disadvantage. Those are the children that really need the instruction. And if they don't get it, they will be the children who appear to be struggling readers. If you look at NAPLAN data, I'm sure your audience knows what NAPLAN
mm.
is. Would you like me to explain that?
Well, let's cover it just in case there are people.
It's the Australian population sampling of students reading, spelling, writing, mathematics. It's done in years 3, 5, 7, and 9. So, whilst it's a fairly blunt instrument and also it can be a contentious topic, I have great support. I personally have great support for NAPLAN, but others don't like it, and I can talk about why. But according to, if you drill down into NAPLAN data, reading proficiency rates have been pretty stagnant for quite some time. And that in itself is a national tragedy because it's showing us that about 30% of children, whether it's year 3 or year 9, they don't tend to catch up if they start behind. Most children don't catch up. We have about 1 in 3 students not reaching reading and writing proficiency rates,
Mm,
which is a pretty awful statistic. But if you drill down even further and relating to what I just talked about in terms of we're already setting up an equity gap, if you're a child who has an Indigenous background, if you're a child who lives in a more remote area compared to an urban area, if you're a child from a economically disadvantaged family, those rates go up to 40 and even 50%. It's
mhm.
1 in 2 Indigenous children are not meeting proficiency benchmarks. So that 30% is a real average. But once we start drilling down into looking at subgroups in the population, it just gets bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
So yes, the short answer to your original question is yes. Your listeners might be interested to look up. You can just Google. It's called The Ladder of Reading and Writing by Nancy Young.
Mhm,
She's got this lovely infographic that I've actually seen up in many schools. But it shows it goes from red to green. I'll start with the top, the green. The really dark green are the small proportion of students, maybe 5 to 10% at best, who learn to read without a lot of instruction,
mhm,
despite the fact that I said reading is biologically secondary. They
mm,
just process the sounds and just get with the process very, very quickly. You hear
mhm,
about some children who go to school kind of almost reading. And then there's a large group of children who are in the paler green that will learn to read because of, with quality instruction. And there's a smaller group in red, a paler red, who fall into that risk group that I've just referred to. Then, if you've got some of the social inequities on your side, it's going to be harder for you to learn to read. And that's when universal classroom instruction is so critical. And then there's a small band at the bottom, and they might be the children who truly have a diagnostic label. Often
mhm,
far that diagnostic label is quite the proportion of students who really do qualify for a diagnosis of dyslexia
mm,
is very small, but that band of students above them may be labelled dyslexic, but in many ways they can be referred to what's been had a title that's quite an uncomfortable term, but powerful: the instructional casualties. The
mhm,
students who didn't have the social advantages, didn't have the exemplary teaching in the early years, didn't get the intervention, and that's become struggling readers.
mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think you're absolutely right that, a lot of people listening to this probably are in those top 2 green bands, clinicians and teachers, but the inverse of that is that every single client that we see at this clinic is in the bottom 2 bands, and it is interesting to think about the instructional casualties because we definitely get I mean, basically everyone that is coming here is investigating learning disorders, but a lot of them will respond really well when you actually just show them explicitly. They go from that, the second from the bottom red band, and they're in the light green band in a short amount of time because they're like, oh, okay, that's how the system works. Cool, I get it now. Thanks for showing me, and they just move on. It's not super fast. Might take 6 or 12 months, but you've given them enough to set the system up, and then they can keep running. Whereas, yes, the kids with genuine learning disorders truly continue to grind, even if you're doing everything right, really intensively, one-to-one intervention, they continue to struggle. So it's a shame that there are so many kids getting mistaken in those 2 groups because sounds like you could potentially completely eliminate those instructional casualties if we were just doing things right consistently nationwide in terms of teaching.
That's absolutely the way I see it as well. Your listeners might have come across the concept of response to intervention, but that is you've described the application of response to intervention, the model so well in that clinical description. And the response to intervention is, picture a triangle with three bands. The bottom band, where there's the most space, is considered tier one, and that's classroom intervention. And then the second from the bottom is tier two, the students who really just need further opportunities to get the information, opportunities to practice, some increased dosage of the instruction. They really should, they're not students who would ever qualify for a clinical diagnosis. And then the tier three, if you think about it, just a little tip, they're the students that need that longer term increased dosage, increased intensity, typically delivered by a specialist such as speech pathologist, special ed teacher, and so forth. So response to intervention is from public health. So if we think about tier one classroom instruction, which every student gets, regardless of if they need to go up into tier two or tier three, it's like a vaccination. You know, we vaccinate against the illness. Some people are still going to get a strain of it and we respond accordingly. But once we get classroom instruction right for all students, regardless of any of those other factors that we know can increase the risk of having difficulties with reading, then we're going to have the resources just for that those tier three students, the
Mm.
resources to really put in and support them. People that do the work that you do and people working really hard in schools and clinics. We don't have the resources to support 30%, sometimes 33, 35% of the students who are presenting according to NAPLAN. And we talk to teachers and they say, I've got half my class really can't read at year level. We don't have the resources to do a good job by every student. So if we adopt this public health model, which really translates in terms of the area that we're talking about, is getting early instruction right and early intervention. So we don't have a gap that just widens. We work to close the gap as soon as we possibly can.
Mm. Yeah, and so in terms of this problem, it's clear that there's a big issue. I mean, if we've got 30% of kids on average, but more in vulnerable minority groups that aren't becoming proficient in reading, and we've seen that sounds like the NAPLAN data is consistent across time that that's just continuing to be a problem. You mentioned the idea that part of the reason that's a problem is because even though we had these big national inquiries and clear recommendations that they weren't taken up. But I suppose a deeper question is why weren't they taken up? Why didn't or couldn't schools and teachers just do this once it was out there?
If I had a clear answer, I would love to give it to you. It's a complex picture, and I don't want to make assumptions on behalf of. I can't speak for everyone, but I'll give it a go. And how I usually conceptualize this. My background: I'm a speech pathologist. By background, I've grown up. I've grown up. I've worked. My professional life has been within the health sphere, and those speech pathologists listening know that from day one, it's drilled into us that we have to abide and align with what the evidence says, the best available evidence, as you would in medicine, in engineering, in aviation, any field. For some reason, and I think there are some factors again around that time in the 60s and 70s when there was a real focus on listening to children, the rights of children, very, very important and noble qualities in anyone who was engaged with children, but somehow we became very sociological in the way that we conceptualized education, and somehow education didn't seem to have the same accountability measures as we do in health sectors and other examples that I've mentioned. So in many ways, positivist evidence, which is the RCTs that we read about and start to really privilege, they just weren't really, they weren't given the same weight in the education sphere. So that research was not making its way into training schools for pre-service teachers. Therefore, the students are graduating without the specific knowledge that they need to have.
Mm.
And yeah, that's really what it's all about. I don't want to sound too doom and gloomish. It's beginning of 2026. And the last 5 years have seen enormous change for the better in Australia, and virtually
Hmm.
all states and territories have now got some sort of mandate or requirement or opt-in program. So it's moving. There is a big move at the moment for universities to be accredited based on some key content that they need to
Hmm.
demonstrate that there is in their courses. So things are really, really moving. But as I mentioned to you before we started recording, Lachlan, I just want to take the words of my colleague and friend Pam Snow, who says a lot of what we do in the solar lab, and I can talk a bit about what that is if you'd like as well, particularly in the short courses that we run mainly for teachers, is hand back the family china that teachers should have been given in their training. And we hear that anecdotally and also in some research that we've done, but frequently saying, no one told me this. No one told me I could actually teach a child and correct them if they made a spelling error in a
Mm,
supportive, in the way that we've been taught in speech. No one taught me. No one taught me that there are 44 phonemes. I just thought there were 26 letters. Things that are just, they're not hard, but someone has to teach you so that
yeah.
you can then feed it forward.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So a big part of the equation, it sounds like, is we need universities who are educating the educators to just consistently and robustly be teaching this literacy instruction to their teachers. Are there
Yes.
also things you've looked into in your research or that you're aware of in terms of sort of on the ground factors like logistical constraints or resource limitations and that sort of things that teachers are facing as well?
Yes. Schools, like universities, many face significant funding constraints. So a lot of teachers and a lot of schools are doing the most fabulous work trying to implement whole program of learning science focused. And by that, I mean teaching explicitly, not the whole day, but making sure that we teach students what they need to know before we ask them to do anything. It's really the kind of polar opposite of discovery learning, trying to implement really high quality reading and writing instruction that's explicitly taught. Not akin to what I've described earlier, with more some discovery learning and a little bit of phonics sprinkled on top.
Mm,
So there's some incredible work going on in terms of implementation of new programs.
mm,
We've got to imagine now that we're in this odd position where some new graduates are graduating with fabulous knowledge because they've been taught. It's not across the board. It will be in time. So there's quite a lot of catch up to do. And then there are
mm,
teachers who may have been teaching for quite some time, but that's the way they've always taught. And we've got teachers who graduated in the 90s and the noughties and so forth. So we've got a really mixed picture. So many teachers and more importantly, education policy makers and school leaders are really working very hard on implementation, not across the board, but there's hub of activity going on. What we do know about implementing any change is that it's a fairly slow process. It's got to be, there's lots of steps to take, bringing people on board, giving them the right professional learning, giving them the appropriate resources, giving them the time release, making sure that people are comfortable with what they're doing. It's people talk about implementation in education being a sort of a 3 to 5 year process, which sounds like a very long time, but the evidence is showing us if we're going to do it well, it does need that time and rigorous focus. If teachers, and I've seen this happen too, said, okay, we're just going to start using the X program because it's really good. Here it is. It's not going to work. Some
mm.
teachers are going to run with it. Others are going to say it's too hard. There'll be fidelity problems. And I'm looking, over a year or 2 years, the school might look at the data and saying, that's not really working. I think we'll go back to what we were doing. So there's a lot of risks and a lot of
Mm,
points where things can go wrong in
mhm,
implementation as well. So I know a lot of state governments, state and territory governments are trying to work really hard on implementation. We've done some our own research looking at what factors really facilitate or present obstacles to implementation. A lot of schools are hiring consultants, coaches. Again,
mhm,
that can be a really positive thing, but I would
yeah,
just encourage anyone who might be thinking about that, who's listening, do your homework on who the consultant is. There's some fabulous people out there,
mm,
but you just like you would with any practitioner, they've got the right
yeah,
background, the right training, and so forth.
yeah. Well, let's maybe try and if we can be a bit concrete about some of those underlying principles for what people can look out for in terms of what's good and what's not. So maybe if we can, if you can speak to it, I mean, I know your expertise is on what we should do, but you probably know a lot about also what's not to be done. Could you perhaps talk about some maybe red flags that if people heard their consultant or saw it in the program their school was running out, things that they should be a bit like, this seems a bit suspicious. Maybe this is whole language or maybe this is balanced literacy. And then would you also mind telling us a bit about the alternative? Like what's the science of reading approach? And if they saw things in the materials included in that they should be like, right, I feel like this is in the right direction. I should focus on that.
Okay. We often get asked, what programs do you recommend? And I never answer that question with an answer directly for a couple of reasons. First of all, I don't want to privilege any one program after another. I have no personal or financial interests, and I'm very likely to miss one that's really good that I haven't mentioned. So I really do like to talk in terms of what you need to look for
Hmm.
in a program. I should also say that there are many commercial products on the market. Some schools and even education departments around our state develop their own as well,
Hmm.
which is a lot of work when there are great tools
Hmm.
out there. But we've been involved in a couple of state departments working on that, and they've been fantastic. What to look for? A program that has an explicit scope and sequence is probably the start point. I'm here referring to early readers, teaching children to read, not when we're looking grade 3 and beyond, thereabouts. A scope and sequence is the following. A program would ideally start with, say, 6 to 8 sounds. The at, p, n, sat pin, as it's often referred to, is a common one, but it doesn't have to be those. But the early group of sounds are the sounds that the children learn. They learn how to the sounds they make, their associated graphemes. They'll do a lot of manipulation and so forth. So if we just take that example of sat pin, I know Jolly Phonics uses sat pin. Little Learners Love Literacy uses it with 2 other sounds as well. You'll note the characteristics are that there are vowels and consonants, so that students can already start making words, short words. But sat pin, you've got in, you can make it an, and then you can make it pan, and so forth.
Hmm.
So vowels and consonants, sounds that are quite distinct, as opposed to sounds that sound similar, like a s and a z, for example, would
Hmm.
not be very helpful. So they're quite distinct in every way in terms of articulation, the way they look on the page, acoustic properties, one's
Hmm.
continuant and stop and so forth. So really just we want to strip away as much complexity as we can in that very first sequence. So all of the resources, all of the practice decodable books would really privilege the first group of sounds. The teacher
Hmm.
teaches those sounds, but what you might see if this program is working is that in term 1 of the first year of school, children are really starting to play around and start getting some agency and sounding out, segmenting sat
Hmm.
early on.
Hmm.
Once that first level is pretty much, most of the students are about 80%, got 80% thereabouts mastery. The next group of sounds is introduced, so it's a very cumulative process. At in, or very simple, one-to-one correspondence and the properties that I've described. By the time you look at, say, stages 4 or 5, depending how the program has split them up, we'll be starting to get into a little bit more complexity, such as double S, double consonants, this letter C, the letter K, and the CK. You wouldn't introduce them all together because that's just going to be cognitive overload,
Hmm.
but gradually building up the complexities. That's really one of the absolute core characteristics that I'd encourage people to look. What is the scope and sequence?
Hmm.
And that information is really, the program is really cumulative, and everything builds on everything.
Yes.
Decodable books, which by definition are books where about 95% of the words are decodable. There's always going to be a couple of tricky words like which just doesn't necessarily play fair, but a couple of words that just have to be taught. But
Hmm.
that 95% of the words are phonically controlled for what the students have been taught. You
Hmm.
don't give students words like little, for example, Little, early on, because they haven't learnt multisyllabic or bisyllabic words in that case,
Hmm.
how to manage what to do with a double T. So you just want to see that the books that students are practicing and typically taking home for practice as
Hmm.
well absolutely align with what is happening in the classroom.
Hmm.
And as I said, once we start putting words in there that children don't have the knowledge or the know-how to read, they're going to do things like guessing,
Hmm.
which is very much aligned with balanced literacy. Oh, look, I can see a box, so it must be a box, where the X is tricky. You don't
Mm,
want to, they're going to maybe look at context cues or strategies that don't necessarily assist.
mhm,
And anything that takes children's eyes off the text, we don't want
mhm,
to see.
mhm,
So we want that notion of explicit instruction applying to early reading instruction is we don't want to ask children to do something we haven't taught them how to do.
mhm,
So
mhm,
there's no benefit in doing so. Once children have, on the way to mastering the code, and you referred to this earlier with a lot of the clinical work that you're doing, kids will sort of be on their way, I think was your term. Once children have learned a lot about the code, we don't have to teach them absolutely everything. Most children will work a lot of things out once they've got the basics.
yeah,
It's a process that David Sher called the self-teaching hypothesis.
mhm,
Once you know about certain things, you can work out a lot more from there. But we really need to give children the solid foundations,
mhm,
just like you would a house without foundations is going to fall over. It's the same
mm,
thing. We can't bypass making sure that children have really mastered the code, and not just so that they can identify, oh, that's a sound, you says that and so forth, but they've got to be able to be picking up, lifting words off the page really accurately and really efficiently.
mhm,
Because children who read like that, as an example, who are deliberate and maybe accurate but not efficient, their reading fluency is going to suffer
mm,
enormously, and
yes,
that is going to have a significant flow-on effect to being poor comprehenders, because they're putting all the energy still into working out what the words are and don't have the cognitive resource to attach meaning to what they're reading.
absolutely. So it's basically, I guess, to summarize for people well, to summarize, but also to introduce another common and important phrase that a lot of people have heard, which is systematic phonics, is the idea of introducing some sounds, a small number of sounds at first, explicitly teaching them. So saying, hey, this is the letter S, this is the sound it makes, here's the letter T, this is the sound it makes. And then gradually increasing the size of that set. So you progressively introduce more and more letters. And then the decodable readers you're talking about is texts that are designed or they're controlled. So only those letters and sounds, for the most part, are in those books, barring a few minor exceptions. So they can actually apply those rules that you just taught them and get faster at sounding out the words and building their fluency and that kind of thing.
That you've described as systematic. That's a great definition of systematic. We often hear about SSPs, systematic synthetic phonics.
Mm-hmm.
And the systematic part is really just another way of describing that cumulative
Mm-hmm.
building that we spoke about just before.
Mm-hmm.
It's systematic, so it's not random. Sometimes when we talk about phonics, there are different types of phonics. Systematic synthetic phonics really has the strongest evidence base.
Mm-hmm.
But the systematic part refers to the teach a small amount first, then build on that, then build on that, and build on that. So it's systematic.
Mm-hmm.
And the synthetic part refers to synthesizing. It's an unfortunate word in my personal view. Synthetic we associate with fake material.
Mm-hmm.
But in this context, it's the process where we encourage children to segment outer words, so calling on a lot of phonemic awareness
Mm-hmm.
knowledge. There's the segmenting out and then blending or synthesizing it back
Mm-hmm.
together. So that's with the S and the S with the phonics, systematic and synthetic phonics.
Mm.
Other phonics types, such as embedded or implicit phonics, could look like this, often done in a more balanced literacy setting,
Mm-hmm.
where students might be in small guided reading groups and student comes to the word whale, for example, and doesn't know how to attack that WH. And the teacher may give some very good instruction about what happens when you see WH, but it's incidental to what they're reading. There's not a systematic
Mm-hmm.
way of, now we've covered this, now we've covered that, which in a much more systematic, cumulative approach. So
Mm-hmm.
an incidental approach, teachers all teach phonics. I think you would not find a teacher anywhere who would say, no, I don't do phonics. I
Mm-hmm.
think that would be employment suicide. It's just, but it's the way that we do the phonics. That's where the devil in the detail is the way that it's implemented. So we're really arguing for, and not because I think it's good, but because it's what the evidence tells us, that a highly systematic approach taught explicitly is going to be the most effective way for all students. So we really want to capture the students that come in with lots of advantage, as well as the students who really need the support. We should be leveling the playing field and getting that tier one with
Mm-hmm.
about 85% of students not needing any additional assistance thereabouts. That's the estimate.
Mm. And I think something that's probably important for parents and teachers to know, which is maybe a bit out of the realm of what's often discussed in the teaching area or the general educational approach to this, but is far more well known in, the allied health scientific field, which is that a really important element of literacy instruction for kids who are in those red bands you were talking about, like they've actually got dyslexia or they're very vulnerable in their reading, is that the instruction needs to be intensive. They need to have a lot of reps of whatever the target is before they're going to learn it and be able to apply it consistently. And systematic phonics gives you the chance to do that reliably, because if the level only has 6 letters in it or 6 sounds, you can just drill those 6 sounds until they've got it. And you don't need to move to the next level. So you can be very intensive on those. Whereas you could imagine in a classroom for students who are doing a more eclectic approach, and let's say it's something more complicated. It's not the letter S, but maybe it's like the AU, the 2 letters AU that go together, which in English often says like the or sound. That's a very hard vowel to learn. And if you only encounter that randomly once every couple of days, you're probably not going to remember it, especially if you're already having trouble. But if your systematic phonics program has an emphasis and it's like, look, this week, it's just the 3 different ways you can spell the or sound, you're getting dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of reps, so you can actually retain it. So I think
And
for people,
teachers know what their students know and what they don't know and what they might need to go back and reteach, or which
exactly.
students might need a bit of extra.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why systematic phonics is such an important way of doing it, because there's those therapeutic principles of intensity and control and monitoring that you can put in. And a way that parents can actually look at this that we observe with our clients is that if you look at the spelling lists that your kids are getting from school, it should, without even having a title, you should probably be able to figure out what the targets are supposed to be, because every word or most of the words should have it in there. Like all the words have a double E, or all the words end in IGH or something like that, because that's the pattern that is being taught. But what we actually often see is that spelling lists are just random assortments of words with no consistent patterns to be learnt. And they're often not controlled for complexity. Like you said, they might be 2 or 3 syllable words like little or alligator or something like that, which those might contain the sounds. It might contain the letter A making the ah sound like the kids are learning, but it's still just too long. So
Yeah.
parents can look for those things too.
I think we need to address, I feel like it's important to address a big elephant in the room
Mm,
around systematic phonics instruction and the cumulative, really structured approach. Again, as we said earlier, reading instruction has been highly contested for decades. The people who have been on the we don't like systematic synthetic phonics camp, there's a range of reasons, but frequently it's raised that it's boring, it's drill and kill. Children will never love reading because it's just because of the drill and kill and it's so controlled. Whereas I have no evidence that being the case, in fact, quite the reverse. Success breeds success. Children will be successful because the teacher is literally a quarter of a step ahead of where they need to be in terms of the instruction or the scaffolding, the feedback that's being given. So whilst children might not take home what looks like beautiful books early on in their school life, and a lot of parents get very concerned about that and need, we can explain why. It appears that children being taught in a more balanced literacy way will be reading more earlier because they'd be looking at being encouraged to use a range of cues, picture cues, guessing cues, and so forth. But they're not really going to facilitate that self-teaching hypothesis that we
mm.
spoke about. Sure, a teacher can do a program and be, can be dull. Maybe are some teachers that do it in a fairly unexciting way, but we've seen so much that once a teacher really knows they know the ins and outs of the program. It's pre-made. A lot of the materials are pre-made, so it takes away that burden of preparing your own lessons and knowing that what is happening in your classroom is happening in the classroom next door, so that all the students are getting the same information and input. So I do want to address the fact that the naysayers will often talk about it being boring and not fun and so forth,
Mm,
and that children they won't love reading. I make a really important point here, and it's not my own point, but we can never love a child to reading. We can give them all the equipment, the right equipment. Some children will become avid readers. Some will do it because they have to get through school and it just won't be their thing. We can never make a child love reading. No one can do that. What we can do is make sure that every child is equipped to make those choices
mm,
in their lives. I do want to just go back to, we've talked about the children in the green and the red with that ladder of reading, or that notion. I do want to emphasize that it's not just children who have some sort of social disadvantage that might fall into those red categories. We have children across the spectrum of all sorts of things, gender and
mm.
social advantage and language background and so forth. But we just know that children who have more vulnerabilities in their circumstances through no fault of their own, but just their postcode, for example, are more vulnerable. I just think I wanted to emphasize that because I didn't want people to think, again, it's the haves and the have nots. We need to reading, and I see education in its fullness as being the social lever that we can pull to reduce equity gaps.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I would second those two things you said. One is that it's not just the necessarily, that the have not groups. I mean, obviously there are certain populations that are more at risk of different things, but I've had clients whose parents are like university lecturers. They're extremely well educated, they're extremely literate, but we've got to remember, of course, kids come out with not identical genetics to their parents, and they can come out with learning disorders and that sort of thing as well, just by random chance. So it can happen to anyone. And I also agree about the idea of I would say I agree that I don't think that the boringness is a relevant metric. I probably would say that yes, in the very early stages, I agree that doing really explicit phonics, especially when it's really isolated and it's like, this is the letter, this makes the sound. If you don't add in fun things to it that are external to that, it can be a bit repetitive, but that's okay. However, what you do see is that, I mean, the kids that I've seen in the clinic that hate reading the most are the ones that can't do it. And they were never taught to do it. And as soon as you do a batch of explicit systematic phonics intervention with them, they go from hating it and hiding under the table and, putting their head down on the book and complaining to, at a minimum, participating and often actually enjoying it. I mean, books have been around for a long time because they're enjoyable. They exist for a reason. They can be fun. And when kids unlock that, that can be great. But at the very least, I've never had a client who's gone from being like, I hate reading, and then you show them how to do it and they get success and they see that they can do it, and they don't at least be like, okay, yeah, look, I'll read the books you want me to, I'll do my schoolwork and that sort of thing. They at least come around to it. So I would definitely agree. Parents should not be worried about early boredom. I think that if it happens at all, it doesn't last long. And in fact, it unlocks the success that then brings the further motivation, and the ball is rolling, and it's all good
I'll
from them.
just add one point to what the really important points you've just made, but in an explicit teaching approach, and if people want to find out about explicit teaching, I can give you some resources and people can just Google, and there's lots of good video examples as well.
Mm,
But one of the core principles to explicit teaching, and this can relate to teaching novice readers to teaching physics for the first time to 15-year-olds, it's
hmm
not specific to a discipline area. But one of the critical things about explicit teaching is that every student is involved in every class. There's
hmm
a wonderful educator and academic, Anita Archer, an American woman who's been around for so long, and she's just given us so much about explicit teaching. And she
mm,
says, learning is not a spectator sport. So we don't want to just hear from the two or three children at the front who know everything and get across it, because the 10 or 15 children behind don't get a word. And it doesn't in any way facilitate their learning. But
Mm.
importantly, teachers don't know if they don't know, because the children aren't given an opportunity to share their knowledge. So, explicit teaching involves explicitly teaching, of course, explaining what you want children to know, modeling, scaffolding, guided practice, but it also involves regularly checking in for understanding. So, whether it's in a classroom or in a clinic room such as yours, teachers use strategies like a whiteboard. So, you write the answer down and everyone has to chin it, and they show the answers. The teachers go, okay, and know who needs some more support. A lot of choral responding, a lot of echo responding. So, everyone is engaged all the time. Cold calling, some people prefer the term non-volunteer responding, not just but saying
Mm.
without people use things like pop sticks, just in random, may not always be completely random. You might want to bring some children in, but all children have to be on all the time
Mhm.
for a whole lot of reasons. We don't learn, the humans do not learn passively. We need to
Mhm.
be active. We need to be touching, manipulating, feeling whatever it is that we
Mm.
are learning about.
Mhm.
It's also critically important for attention, because if we don't have attention, the whole learning process doesn't get started.
Mm.
Again, that breaking some of the myths that exist around explicit instruction is it's just like this. It's anything but. It's highly interactive.
Mhm.
Students are responding almost as frequently as the teacher. Everyone is engaged. And that's why it can't go on all day, every day, because it's not feasible. Teachers
Mm.
and students would be exhausted. But of course, there has to be time when mastery is building for application and more application work, inquiry work.
Mhm.
But again, if there are any parents listening who are thinking about educating where they might send their children to school, that's certainly an important area that you might want to ask about. What's the
Mm.
instructional model that you use? And I think in speech pathology, we kind of get trained in that way anyway. We're sort of really closely monitoring, but we also have the luxury of working with one or a small group, as opposed to teachers who have to manage a large group.
Yeah.
And one of the key aspects also is whole class teaching. There is going to be a range of students' ability,
Mhm.
but whole class teaching means everyone's hearing everything all the time.
Mhm.
And the children who are a bit behind don't get further behind because they don't get exposed to what's going on. There's
Mm.
lots of nuances around this notion or this concept of explicit instruction as beyond explicitly telling students, teaching students, and showing them what they need to do.
Mhm. Absolutely. So where do we go from here then? I mean, we've kind of talked about, explicit teaching and systematic phonics being important. And we've talked about universities, the emphasis on universities doing pre-service teacher training that is evidence-based and aligns with the science. But is there anything else? And if not, I mean, how do we actually get the whole country on board with those things?
We're in a complex situation at the moment for a lot of this demands around us, but we are, as a whole community, society, reading less. And when we read short form, quick bites of news headlines and so forth. The whole notion of long form reading is, don't want to say it's a dying art, but it's not very popular
Mm.
now. People don't read books for pleasure. They
Mhm.
just read because what they have to, because of academic demands, work demands. So there's a small growing movement of people trying to advocate and promote the value of long
Mhm.
form reading. And can blame screens. I don't want to do a straight cause effect process, but we just, as a society, whether we are proficient readers or have struggled and have a bad
Mm.
relationship with reading, we are generally reading less as a community. I think
Mm.
that's one angle to take, just in terms of just promoting a love of reading, because it's a good skill to have for all the
Mhm.
things we know it gives us access to post school training, vocation, all those sorts of things. But reading, if you particularly think about literature, it's our way into build our theory of mind, build empathy, understand other cultures and different types of relationships and so forth. So
Mm.
that's one aspect. I don't have a simple answer to that, but it really does, we need to get all kids off to a good start, and then just shifting culture towards more
Mhm.
reading. That's not an easy thing to do. Probably going a little bit more granular, what next? So we teach kids to read, they become proficient readers, they're reading at good rate, accuracy, the reading fluency is good, but it's the what next. Why we teach this is because we want students to read for meaning or understanding. It's ultimately why we read. If we don't if we read something we don't understand, it's not satisfying. We've all
Mhm.
perhaps had experiences where we read something on a topic that we don't know about, or it's really dense. It's hard. No
Mm.
one chooses to read about, read things that are just too hard for them.
Yeah.
So the whole notion of reading comprehension, I have no doubt that you would have referrals, children referred or adolescents referred to your clinic, and many others here, and many teachers may be concerned about comprehension.
Mhm.
And once again, that's also been an area of contention in terms of how to teach it, how to intervene. For a
Mm.
long time, there's been this concept of comprehension strategies like read it, summarize it, find the main idea, and so forth. Now,
Mm.
that's all well and good if you can read accurately and efficiently.
Yeah.
It's also much easier if you know what you're reading about.
Mhm.
So it's not really a transferable skill to practice summarizing and finding the main idea. Important skills, but where we really get our bang for our buck is building students' language knowledge, their knowledge about sentence structure. So, really big focus on syntax and morphology, building vocabulary. Vocabulary is just such a pivotal part of classroom and clinical intervention.
Mhm.
We can't teach children every word, but once when the vocab kind of snowballs as well, and background knowledge. So rather than teaching, reading a book on how igloos are made in term one, and then we go to the jungle animals in term two, having a consistent kind of scope and sequence for knowledge building is equally important.
Mhm.
Uh, um, a study, it's an old study now called the baseball study. I'll just give you a really potted summary of
Mm.
demonstrating what I mean. In this study, the researchers took students, kids who were about, I think about they were 13, like year 7, year 8 equivalent. There was less than 100, I can't recall the exact number. So it wasn't a large sample, but a sizable sample.
Mhm.
And the children were divided according to two domains. One was those students who were really proficient at read word lists really quickly and accurately, and those who couldn't. So they were
Mhm.
divided on they call good and poor readers. And they were also divided on their knowledge of baseball. So high knowledge baseball, low knowledge baseball. And then they were all given a passage to read and answer some comprehension questions.
Mhm.
Now, not surprisingly, the group that did the best were those students in the high reading, high baseball knowledge. But the second best group, and not by much, if you look at the graphs, they're very small. The next best group were the high baseball knowledge, low readers.
Huh.
And then it went on from there. So it
Yeah.
really tells us that the power of having background knowledge, so you know, when you see the word fielder, for example, you know what that is, as opposed to how does it, what do they mean, so forth. So background knowledge we know gives enormous bang for buck. And that's one
Mm.
of the reasons why overall reading comprehension is really complex to assess, because what is background knowledge for one student may be completely unfamiliar to other students. So again, leveling the playing field is building students' oral language, syntax, vocabulary, morphology, even etymology, the sort of history of words, and really targeted attempt at building background knowledge. Of
Mm.
course, again, we can't teach students about every single topic, but in schools they'll have a really doing this really well. We'll have a scope and sequence in the same way that I talked about the sounds, the
Mhm.
graphemes and phonemes of the alphabetic code. I'll have a similar process for vocabulary and for background knowledge
Mm.
as well. And then students can be taught how to summarize, how to get the main idea. But if they don't know about the topic, they might be really proficient readers, but like the low baseball students, if they don't know much about baseball, a lot of terms just are not going to land well for them.
Yeah. And that's highlights very well how complex reading comprehension is. There's so many different parts, but people don't talk about it like that. They do say, you know, how do I improve reading comprehension? Or like, what technique improves reading comprehension? And there's not one thing. I mean, the research does show there are a range of strategies, like you mentioned, that are, moderately to reasonably effective if you teach them in isolation, like main idea identification and that kind of thing, summarization, etc. But only moderately. You need vocabulary knowledge, you need background knowledge. And as you said, it's impossible to kind of teach all of that in one go. But schools are really well placed because obviously it's a massive institutional system that goes for a big chunk of your life, and you just systematically build this ecosystem of knowledge. But we also talk to all of our families, every single family that comes through the clinic, we talk to them about what we call language rich lifestyles, which
Mm.
is the idea of just like read a lot, listen to podcasts, watch interesting YouTube content, play language based games, watch documentaries, whatever it is, anything that gets new language and ideas in, even if it's not a structured program like schools might have, like you're talking about, where they've got a sequence for how they're going to plan it. Just by sheer volume, you're going to learn so many things, so many words, be exposed to so much language and background knowledge that over time you will be able to make more connections, which then, the snowball is rolling and progress begets more progress. So I think while the education system has a really vital role, I would say that teachers can be recommending this to their students too. Just get out there and just do anything, read anything, watch
Mm.
anything informational. And same with parents. Sit down with your kids, read any book, talk to them about new content, etc. Because it all helps in some way. In the same way, to use another analogy, we also often talk about it as like the personal trainer analogy. I mean, if you went to a personal trainer every day, you're probably going to get in great shape. But you're going to get in the decent. If you just do literally any random exercise every day for 30 minutes, it'd still be pretty good if you do that every day for years and years and years. So yeah, I think there's very explicit ways to do it, and there's also kind of just lifestyle ways to do it, and just building it in is super important.
Yes, yes. We think about learning to break the alphabetic code, like how to read words, how to spell, as constrained skills. Once you've got it, you've got it. But you'll never forget that.
Mm,
And then beyond that, reading comprehension, vocabulary, unconstrained. We're
hmm
always building our vocabulary well into, to many of us, the last breath that we take. So I really love that idea of the language rich lifestyle. I really do support it. And we know that, and then certainly in speech pathology, we're taught that the human brain is wired to learn language.
hmm
But that's a bit of a false, can be a bit misleading, because we want children to go to school and they're 4 and 5 with age appropriate, at least, oral language. We know that we know that there's data that's showing us that that's not the case. But ideally, we want children to be developing as they should with their oral language. But it doesn't stop there. The language of typically language developing child at 5, they're going to have much, much greater needs by the time they're mid to high primary school and secondary school.
mm,
And a lot of instruction will be needed there as well. We don't just continually grow language in that naturalistic way as we do in the
hmm
preschool years. We get offered a great start the way our brains have been wired, but as educators and clinicians, we need to really be pouring that language lifestyle in, whether it's implicit reading, listening, just using big words like, oh, the bag's adjacent to the door. Adjacent means, like incidental things like that, as
hmm
well as having some, a scope and sequence that ideally goes across a school.
hmm
We haven't really talked about whole school approaches, but we
Yeah.
certainly see, and it's in many ways it's logical why a whole school approach is ideal. One, it strips away a lot of complexity for teachers, but also the year 3 teachers know exactly what's happened in year 2, what topics they've covered, what vocabulary they've
hmm
covered, and so forth.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. So if we could get some of these things in place, how would we actually know if it's working or if it has worked? What would that look like?
Well, NAPLAN, a blunt instrument that it is, we would ideally see that shift away from 30%, which, as was said by Jordana Hunter from the Grattan Institute, who wrote a fabulous report called The Reading Guarantee. If anyone's interested, it's open access, a national tragedy, because we
hmm
are a first world country with a lot of good brains, a lot of knowledge in this country. We shouldn't be in this situation.
Mm,
So we'd see it in NAPLAN, but more importantly, at schools monitor their own data very carefully. And whilst there can be lots of celebration for the students really moving ahead, we often don't look at the 25 or so percent, whatever your number is, who are struggling and behind. So we would see, instead of the bell curve that we know about, where there's quite a spread, what I'd love to see is a much more squished up bell curve, so that we can certainly have children maybe at the top end just moving really quickly still, but that the tail, we want to shift the tail of the curve so that there's far, far fewer who need intensive support. There will always be students, children, adolescents who need intensive support, but it should be 2 to 5% of students, not 30% of students. I think that's the key marker. We also see it in terms of some social outcomes as well, because poor academic success is a significant risk factor for many, many things within school, as in disengaging from school, acting out, truancy, and so forth. But importantly, as a whole, it's associated with a whole lot of post school negative consequences, such as poor ability to financially support oneself, psychosocial challenges. We know that there is a strong relationship between poor academic success and being involved in youth justice and the adult justice system. So, again, they're going to be big ticket items to measure, and it's not going to be a cause and effect people can read so they do less crime. But we know that there's an unacceptably high association. It's like something like, I think the figures I last read, something like 4 in 5 people in the prison system have had some compromised educational experiences, hate school, exited early, all of those things that we know are significant risk factors for antisocial, criminogenic, or just disadvantaged, economically struggling, socially struggling. Reading and writing is also very much a social act as well as it is an academic requirement.
Yeah. And look, you've kind of just covered off what my final question was going to be, which is, what does it actually mean if we could do this? Because there are people who are probably like, "Oh, look, I don't really care that much if my kid reads books or not."
Mhm.
And maybe that's fair, but the implications are bigger. And like you've said, there's social factors, there's work factors, there's idea factors in terms of yeah, like there's a lot of famous things through history where books have completely changed the course of history of
Mm.
how people in different countries see things and how history has played out. But even on a more day to day level, yeah, just what job you can get, what level of education you can get, and how the economy of the country is running all kind of hinges on these foundational things that build up to that. So hopefully everyone can see how important that is. And I would really encourage people to go and look at the work that you guys are doing at the Solar Lab, the Science of Language and Reading Lab at Latrobe University. If people want to get into the academics, I don't know exactly how many papers you've published, Tanya, but I was going through your pages and pages of things that you've published in this area. So there's a wealth of research there that people can look at. So I hope people look into that. I hope people see how important this is. And thank you so much, Tanya, for coming on. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation.